Hello. Today we're going to talk about cider making with AEB technologies. And AEB technologies intervene in the cider making process, let's say, starting from the mashing. We have products for the selling of the juice, fermentation, aging, and we have cartridges for filtration. To prepare the juice, so to squeeze more liquid out of the apples, what AEB can supply are enzymes. Enzymes are natural products, they're proteins derived from nature. Fungus, for example, is a producer of enzymes. They have the characteristic of accelerating reactions. So if we want to mash and get juice out of the apple, enzyme will make this reaction happen faster, naturally. They're very specific for their substrate, so it's very important to know which kind of enzyme we're getting. In the food industry, there are proteases being used, lipases, carbohydrates is what we're looking to use for cider making. We have beta-glucanase, amylase, xylonase, cellulase, and pectinase that fall in this category of carbohydrates. Why you want to use enzymes? To extract juice out of the cells. The cells have a very complex structure as far as the wall. You can see here, this is a graphic representation of the cell wall, where a lot of pectins encapsulate, let's say, the juice that we want to extract. So what we need to do is to get rid of these pectins, which are heteropolysaccharides. So they can be as simple as this chain, but they can be more complex, formed by a mixture of a highly branched acidic and neutral polymers. In all these different forms, they constitute the walls of the cells that contain the juice. We see them in the outer primary cell wall with random cellulose microfibrils in pectin, middle lamella between cells, mostly pectin, inner secondary cell wall with regular cellulose microfibrils embedded in pectin and hemicellulose. So getting rid of the pectins first will definitely help us a lot with mashing this wall and releasing the juice. Pectofruit, enzyme pectofruit, is the enzyme that AEB proposes for this process. Is a mixture of activities like pectinliase, pectinesterase, polygalacturonase, and secondary activities that we'll see how they work, rhamnosidase and arabinase. This is the main activity action with the pectinliase, the pectinesterase, and polygalacturonase acting in different points of the chain. But the chain, we can see the galacturonic acid chain, which is a basic pectin like this. We have seen the activity of PL, PG, and PE in this linear basic pectin, can be more complex, can have a rhamnose in it, can have sugars like arabinase, galactase, that make a more like hairy, more complex pectins. So the secondary activity that we mentioned here, the rhamnosidase and the arabinase, are to act on the secondary chains that make the pectins a little more complex to destroy. Another thing that we can have, especially when we pick apples this nice that are not completely ripe, is starch. Starch tend to convert fully pretty much when the apples are ready to fall from the tree. So if we do pick apples this nice that probably have a lot of starch, starch can be further converted in sugars to have more fermentable sugar, and to do so, instead of waiting time, we can use amylase, an enzyme again. Also, apples can have glucans that can be a problem for filtration, for selling. So this enzyme also contains glucanase, which get rid of glucans. This is a little bit of the activity of a basic amylase. In this case, the alpha amylase, which cut randomly the starch, the beta amylase that cuts it right where we form fermentable sugar, amyloglucosidase that cuts it a little bit everywhere, but the Brumix Plus, which is the enzyme we propose for this stage, contains all three of these plus the glucanase. Where and when we apply these enzymes. This is a little bit the flow chart of how the cider juice is produced before fermentation. We see the crushing mill, an oxidation tank, and that's here is where we add the pectinase to facilitate the breaking of the walls of the cells and the release of the juice during the pressing. When we do have the juice, this is when we add more pectinase to clarify better the juice, but also amylase to improve the sugar content and get rid of the starch. We can also be a problem for clarification. Now, clarification, we can just do centrifugation or selling. By using a silica solution like Spindazole SB1, we can have an improved and more efficient selling or centrifugation. Spindazole is charged and so attract particles and forms flocculus, and especially is heavy, is a mineral, and so it compresses better the bottoms. Your sediments is going to be less fluffy. Also, when we have a clean juice, we want to make sure it's clean from microorganisms. So potassium metabisulfite is always been a good preservative for this kind of stage. It's also a good antioxidant, especially when used in synergy with ascorbic acid and gallic tannin, a very strong natural antioxidant. So this product, Antioxin SBT, contains all three of these products. I would go with 50 to 100 ppm. Now, when we have the clean juice, now it's time to ferment. A lot of cider makers, especially the craft cider maker, will wait for the natural yeast that are already on the apples to ferment, but this can take a long time, especially if pesticides are used on the apples and the apples don't have a lot of microflora on it. So we can use selected yeast. The selected yeast also dominate various contaminant bacteria that can lead to acetic acid and to vinegar. So which kind of yeast do we want to choose? But this depends on the character of the cider that we want. Starting from the apples, we can decide to use very bland, fresh eating varieties like culinary apples that are lower in tannin and acid, or we can use like the Gravestone, like the very traditional bitter and rich in tannins apples that have a lot more character. Or we can introduce a variable of the yeast, so a more neutral yeast or a characterizing yeast. So the yeast can give us really a differentiation on the flavors that we're going to get in the final fermented hard cider. So here is a little bit of the yeast that AEB offers to the cider makers. We offer a champagne yeast. It's called Fermol Charmat. Cider maker will use a champagne yeast to ferment, let's say, neutrally the apple cider. So kind of bringing forward just the apple aromas. Is very neutral, doesn't leave any trace of sweetness, has a very high alcohol tolerance. Obviously it needs to be fed with the proper amount of nitrogen. It needs to be aerated to build the right amount of biomass. A similar yeast belonging to the same subgenre of the Baianus is the Fermol Blanc, which we also ferment very dry. It will leave a little more of its own characterization of fruit, but also is very apple forward. More characterizing yeast we borrow from the brewing industry. So the Weiss aroma is a typical Effenweiser yeast, traditionally employed to make those cloudy German-style wheat beers, and the Weiss aroma will characterize the cider with a little bit of banana, so very typical for the Weiss beer. And then also spicy, let's call it cloves. So it definitely brings characteristics that the previous two yeast will not bring. Another yeast that characterizes a little bit the cider more than the apple will do, so a characterization coming from the yeast, is the lager yeast, which is also used to make very clean and easy drinking cider, but with a very good complexity and expression of esters. This has to be fermented kind of cold, definitely under 20 Celsius. Here is a beer that belongs very much to the last current of craft cider makers. Is also dry hopped and is fermented with an ale yeast for beer. So ale yeast in cider will leave like a smooth finish, almost a sweetness, and integrates very well if brewers decide to use hops in this cider. Another line that we have created for cider is a line of wine yeast that bring a lot of complexity in esters. And all the esters that they'll bring are defined in the name of the particular yeast. So the thermobrewed citrus obviously will bring lime and lemons, the brew nectar, nectarine, and apricots, and the thermobrew fragrance with white blossom, minty, and the brew fruity, more like a summer and tropical fruit character, like pineapple, very mango, very tropical flavor, this one. And then the thermobrew berry, more like blueberry, blackcurrant. So all different characterization in esters that are derived from the amino acids present in the juice as precursors of aromatics, or that we can add with the nutrients called thermoplast fruity that will supply more of this amino acid that are ultimately our precursors for the aromatics. So all these yeasts are very good because of their enzymatic reaction to create esters as we described, like these ones, but they need the precursors, which can be supplied by the juice, but also by adding the thermoplast fruity. In fact, we see that in apple juice, the quantity of nitrogen, yeast available nitrogen, is not very high. We take as a comparison the grape juice is about a third at its max. Yes, there are amino acids of different kinds, and those we said are precursors of aromatics, but the total amount of these nitrogen components, like the amino acid, is not very high. So to add some in the form of this product from thermoplast integrator or the thermoplast fruity is very important. What's the difference between adding the fruity or the integrator? With the integrator, we're adding also a lot of NH4, with which is the ammonium phosphate, which ultimately will boost more this number, the yeast available nitrogen. So it will bring to a level that is comfortable for the yeast to finish a good fermentation. Let's say with 30 grams hectoliter, 300 ppm, you can comfortably ferment 6 to 7% cider. If you don't add this, in most situations, this amount of yeast available nitrogen will not be enough for the yeast to complete the fermentation. So you have a very sluggish, long fermentation. Whereas if you add the nutrient, obviously the yeast will be able to finish. Adding nitrogen in the form of amino acids, which is different, is more like the a fraction of this, and this is a very balanced formulation. But if you want to say exaggerate with amino acid and have more of this base for aromatics, the thermoplast fruity is what you need. This is a little bit of the process that these amino acids will go through with this reaction, enzymatic reaction that the yeast will do. So from amino acid, alpha keto acid, aldehyde, alcohol, the final product would be alcohol, but because it's toxic for the yeast will proceed and form an ester that is also useful for the yeast to attract vectors like bees and flies that will go into the fermented product, the cider in this case, touch the liquid and bring the cell of yeast elsewhere. So it's a way that the yeast has to propagate, basically. At the end, when we have our fermented cider, we can do different things. And one thing that lately has been done is age the cider in oak barrel. I mentioned before the hopping, but this is another characterization that we can do with a very good extract of oak that we have. Is actually a tannin, it's not even an extract. It will bring a tannic component to it, but also an antioxidant and also an aromatic. So it will taste like it was aged in barrel. This is the Lagetan Barrique Goudron, but we have a whole line of Lagetan Barrique that can be added. I would add during fermentation for integration. A lot of time though, you can add at the end just to dose exactly the amount that you need before you go into the bottle. So thank you very much. This was the presentation, and I hope you enjoyed it.